In this episode, we build the skill of hearing an AI pitch and responding like an auditor, which means asking questions that bring clarity, evidence, and accountability into the room without turning the conversation into a fight. Beginners often assume auditors are people who say no, but good auditing is not about blocking progress. It is about making sure progress is real, controlled, and responsibly governed, especially when a system can influence decisions that affect people, money, safety, or trust. Stakeholders often pitch AI solutions with excitement, and excitement is not a problem, but excitement can hide missing requirements, weak controls, and unrealistic assumptions. Your job is to ask questions that reveal what is actually being proposed, what the organization expects to gain, what risks are being introduced, and what evidence will prove the system is appropriate. Task 1 is about evaluation, and evaluation begins with questions that force specifics rather than slogans. By the end of this lesson, you should have a mental toolkit of question types that help you quickly sort a pitch into what is clear, what is missing, and what must be controlled before the organization can rely on the solution. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful first move is to ask questions that clarify the use case and scope, because without scope, nothing is auditable. When someone says they want AI to improve a process, you want to know which process, which decision points, and which outcomes are being targeted. You also want to know what the system will and will not do, because scope creep is a common risk that begins as an innocent expansion. A scope question sounds like, what exact decision will the model influence, and what action will follow from the output? Another scope question is, who will use the output, and in what workflow step will they see it? A third scope question is, what is the boundary, meaning what the model is explicitly not allowed to be used for without a new review? These questions matter because they translate an idea into an auditable system definition. They also reveal whether the pitch is grounded in an actual operational change or is simply a technology experiment searching for a purpose. Auditors ask scope questions first because scope creates the frame for every other question about risk, evidence, and controls. Once scope is clear, the next set of questions targets business goals and success measures, because opportunity must be measurable to be meaningful. Stakeholders often say the system will increase efficiency, reduce cost, or improve decision-making. But those claims can be slippery unless they are tied to specific metrics and baselines. A strong question is, how will success be measured, and what baseline are you comparing against? Another is, what is the minimum improvement that would justify the effort and the ongoing governance burden? Another is, what trade-offs are you willing to accept, such as higher false alarms in exchange for catching more true cases or slower processing in exchange for higher accuracy? These questions matter because AI projects can look successful if you choose the wrong metric, while the real business problem remains unsolved. They also matter because governance and monitoring are not free, and the organization should understand the cost of responsible oversight. For beginners, it is important to hear these questions as supportive, not hostile, because they help stakeholders define what they truly want and avoid disappointment later. Clear success measures also become audit evidence, because you can later verify whether the system delivered what it promised. Now move into questions about data, because data is where many pitches collapse when you ask for specifics. A pitch might assume data is available and clean, but organizations often discover late that key fields are missing, inconsistent, or stored in incompatible systems. A basic data question is, what data will the model use as inputs, and where does that data come from? A deeper question is, how trustworthy is the data, how complete is it, and what processes exist to validate quality? Another important question is, do we have permission to use this data for this purpose, and how is sensitive data protected? You also want to ask about labeling or outcome definitions if the model is supervised, because labels determine what the model learns. When stakeholders answer vaguely, that is a signal of a hidden assumption that can become an audit finding later. Auditors ask data questions because data choices drive performance, fairness, and privacy risk, and because data governance is often weaker than people realize. For beginners, The key habit is to keep data questions concrete and tied to sources, ownership, and evidence rather than using abstract language. Another set of questions targets model outputs and decision use, because many risks come from how outputs are interpreted, not from the model itself. A model might output a score, a label, a ranking, or generated content, and each output type requires different controls. A strong question is, what exactly does the output represent, and what does it not represent? Another is, what confidence or uncertainty information is provided, and how are users expected to interpret it? Another is, what decision rule turns the output into action, such as thresholds for escalation or requirements for human review? You also want to ask, what happens when the model is uncertain, wrong, or encounters unusual inputs? These questions matter because stakeholders sometimes treat a score as if it is a verdict or treat fluent generated text as if it is factual, and those misunderstandings create real harm. Auditors care because decision design is governance design, and governance design is what prevents misuse. On the exam, scenarios often hinge on this point, where the best answer emphasizes clarity in output meaning and controlled decision use rather than more model complexity. Validation questions come next because a pitch often implies the model will work without describing how readiness will be proven. A strong validation question is, how will you test that the model performs acceptably for this specific use case, not just in general? Another is, what thresholds define acceptable performance, and who approve those thresholds? Another is, how will you test for uneven performance across different groups, situations, or edge cases that matter? You also want to ask, will the validation be independent enough to be credible, meaning not just the builders grading their own work without oversight? These questions matter because validation is the bridge between a promising idea and a trustworthy system. Without validation evidence, deployment becomes a gamble, and in high-impact contexts, that gamble is unacceptable. Auditors ask validation questions to make sure the organization has a plan to prove fit for purpose, not just to hope for it. For beginners, it helps to remember that validation is not one number. It is a set of checks designed to reflect real-world conditions and real-world consequences. Monitoring and lifecycle questions are essential because AI systems can change in behavior even when nobody intentionally changes the code. A pitch might focus on deployment and ignore what happens in month 3 or month 9, which is where drift, misuse, and control decay appear. A key question is, what will you monitor after deployment, and how will you know if performance is degrading or outcomes are becoming unsafe? Another is, what triggers action, such as retraining, rollback, pausing usage, or adding human review? Another is, who owns monitoring, and what is the escalation path when monitoring indicates a problem? You also want to ask about change management. How are updates approved, documented, and traced to versions? These questions matter because ongoing oversight is what turns a project into a controlled system, and controlled systems are what audits can evaluate reliably. If monitoring ownership is unclear, the organization may discover problems only after harm occurs. In exam terms, monitoring questions often point to Domain 3 thinking, but in Task 1 evaluation they appear early because responsible adoption requires a lifecycle plan. Governance and accountability questions are the backbone of audit thinking because they determine whether controls are real or just promises. A strong question is, who is accountable for the system's outcomes, including harm, compliance exposure, and business impact? Another is, who has authority to approve deployment, approve changes, and accept residual risk that cannot be eliminated? Another is, what documentation must exist to support accountability, such as requirements, validation results, monitoring reports, and decision logs? You also want to ask, what policies apply, such as privacy policy, security standards, ethics guidelines, and record retention rules, and how compliance will be demonstrated? These questions matter because organizations can build technically strong systems that are still ungoverned, and ungoverned systems are fragile and risky. Auditors focus on governance because governance is how organizations prove they are in control of their own decisions. For beginners, the important point is that governance questions are not about bureaucracy for its own sake. They are about ensuring someone can answer for what the system does and can take action when outcomes are unacceptable. A useful way to understand these question types is to notice how they expose hidden assumptions without accusing anyone of negligence. When you ask about data sources, you surface assumptions about availability and permission. When you ask about outputs and decision rules, you surface assumptions about how humans will behave and how much automation is acceptable. When you ask about validation, you surface assumptions about what success means and what errors are tolerable. When you ask about monitoring, you surface assumptions about stability and about who will respond to problems. When you ask about governance, you surface assumptions about ownership and authority. This is why the right questions are so powerful in an AI pitch meeting. They turn excitement into a plan, and they turn vague confidence into evidence expectations. They also create a shared understanding that responsible AI requires more than a good demo. It requires controlled deployment and sustained oversight. On the exam, answer options that reflect this assumption surfacing mindset often represent the auditor's best next step. It also helps to practice how these questions sound in real conversation, because audit effectiveness depends on communication style, not just technical correctness. Questions work best when they are framed as clarification, not confrontation, and when they connect to shared goals like safety, trust, and sustainable success. For example, instead of implying the system is risky, you can ask what safeguards are planned to ensure it behaves consistently over time. Instead of implying the team lacks discipline, you can ask what documentation will be maintained so decisions can be explained and improved. This matters for beginners because it shows that auditors are not enemies of innovation. They are guardians of responsible innovation. The exam will not test your tone directly, but it will test whether you choose actions that improve clarity and control rather than actions that jump ahead without a foundation. When you understand the intent behind the questions, the correct exam answers become easier to recognize because they align with disciplined evaluation. As we close, remember that asking the right questions during an AI pitch is the first practical step of Task 1 evaluation, because it determines whether the organization moves forward on evidence or on enthusiasm. The question categories that matter most are scope and use case, success measures and baselines, data sources and permissions, output meaning and decision rules, validation and thresholds, monitoring and lifecycle control, and governance and accountability. You do not need to memorize a script, but you do need to internalize the habit of converting vague claims into specific, testable expectations. When you do that, you help the organization avoid painful surprises and you create a foundation for auditable controls. In the next episode, we will separate good idea AI from high-risk AI using audit logic, which builds directly on the questions you learned here. For now, practice listening to any AI claim and immediately asking, what does success mean? What data enables it? What decision uses it? And what evidence will prove it stays safe?
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.